Autism sprinter, think equity, yeah. It's time to give the power back to the people. We're fighting to make our beliefs equal. Look at the failed policies and how they treat you. We got strength, yeah, we're far from feeble. This is for anyone with autism or a disability. Time to unite, show 'em how strong our will can be. Move readily, we're promoting equity. A non-profit platform, that's the recipe. Now throw your hands up, we finally got a winner. Think equity with Autism Sprinter. Now throw your hands up, we finally got a winner. Think equity with Autism Sprinter. It's time to make a change. It's time to stand up for what we believe in. Equality and equity across the board. No matter your race, nation, or creed, disability, or your needs. Yes, it gotta be equal. It gotta be right.
What's up, mi gente? How are you? It's me, Jahida Lopez, the founder of Autism Sprinter. And today I'm super excited, right? Because as you guys know, I love connecting with other autism parents who are doing big things, who are part of the advocacy here in our communities. And I'm excited to have Stephanie Rodriguez-Ruiz here, who is a staff attorney for the Children's Law Center. And we're going to have a conversation, very candid, very real conversation about autism and what it is to navigate special education. As many of you guys know, that in this pandemic, a lot of our babies have lost a lot of services. And we know that many of our school districts have a lot of services to make up. And so we're just going to kind of talk about this with the autism community during Autism Awareness, well, to us, Autism Acceptance Month, and to make sure that parents have the tools and the skills that they need to making sure that once we move this past this pandemic, that you know how to self-advocate for yourself, and you can find people in your community who are advocating behind the scenes, rattling the cages of systems to make changes for our babies. So without further ado, I want to bring on Stephanie. What up?
Hey, how are you?
Well, girl, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you. So let's start. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Guys, and the best part of this, she's an autism mom. And she's a mommy of twins, y'all. Like, look at her. She looks so beautiful. Like, I want to be like her. Okay.
So, my name is Stephanie Rodriguez-Ruiz, as Jahida said, and I'm a staff attorney at the Children's Law Center. The Children's Law Center is based out of Lynn, and we are a free legal aid service for families, low-income families, who are looking for advocacy, whether it be in education, child welfare, immigration. And I handle the education piece in Essex County. And as Jahida said, I am an autism mom, so I do have a child on the spectrum. I have another child with a disability as well, so I have 3 children. And also autism is something that's very close to myself and my family. So being raised in a single parent household, being a Latina, being someone who has experienced what it's like to sit on the other side of an IEP table, that intimidating feeling, that feeling of, I don't know, being judged, right? And you're having your motherhood questioned. I know all about that. And so I decided to be an education attorney because I really wanted to help put my people in a position where we can advocate for our children. And I hope to do that today.
So wait, so you touched upon like real 3 important key elements that here in Autism Sprinter we talk about a lot. And we, in the community of color, we don't talk about disabilities too often. And kind of like we were talking before we went live, is that the reality is there isn't any nonprofits in the urban community, in the inner city community, in the communities of color that specifically are disability-based nonprofits that offer a service for the BIPOC community. So many of our families are navigating systems without understanding their rights where to find their laws, or even people that they call like you who can answer those questions. Can you talk to us, especially you being in Lynn, because Lynn has a large population of immigrants that are English speaking families. And kind of to kick this off, when we thinking about autism and disability, what do you find in the space and the work that you do to be one of the biggest barriers for families, specifically families of color?
So I think that you mentioned it, right? There's a very different culture with us, right? With Black and brown people. For example, some of us grew up in households where it was the norm to discipline your children, right? It was the norm to be a strict parent, to make sure that your child wasn't getting out of pocket, right? So that was what we grew up with, right? And then we have children growing up with disabilities, and I'll touch on the part about not even identifying disabilities, but we have children growing up with disabilities and they're acting, let's say they're acting in a way that to you, culturally, your belief is that this is disrespectful, right? This is not how my child should be acting. This is disrespectful towards adults, and therefore I'm going to discipline my child. And we don't think, right? Initially, we don't think, well, maybe my child has a disability. Maybe they can't help it, right? Maybe they need the tools in order to express themselves in a different way. We don't, naturally, we're not thinking of that based on our culture. And I don't mean to say this is a, one size fit all situation, because that may not be the case in some families, but it is a lot of the time for families of color. And one thing that you said, Jahida, which is so true, right? And I see this in Lynn all the time. So I'm glad that you brought this up, is that it's almost taboo to say that your child has a disability, right? It's taboo. I mean, I was speaking to a family the other day and I talked to her about autism, and I can't remember in what context I brought it up. And I asked her if she was familiar with autism, and she didn't know. She was like, does that mean, those are the kids that are different, right? And it's just interesting. And this is a Spanish speaking woman, a newcomer to the country. And this is not something that's universally known. So when we talk about autism awareness, and as we call it, autism acceptance, there really is not even an awareness for it in certain cultures. And then there's that feeling of, wait, so is my child different? Is there something wrong with my child? Why does my child have a disability? They don't know. My child is just, that's just the way that he or she is. So that's one barrier that we have to get over, one hurdle that we have to get over ourselves as parents and as Black and brown parents. For sure. Yeah.
And you kind of talked about the access, right? And when we look at access, what is it that you think our families need, especially post-pandemic, around accessing tools that they need to better advocate for their children? Because kind of like what we were saying, before the pandemic hit, a lot of our babies didn't get a lot of their services because, we went through this whole remote barrier for some time. The government had issued a letter that they then took back, saying that there wasn't, school districts wasn't responsible for giving services. Next thing you know, a lot of moms and dads were like, no, we're not doing this. And then they issued another letter saying that, they can provide services based with what they can do. How can we kick off this conversation about special education and how to access those tools?
So first things first, you have to identify the need, right? So that's the main thing. That's where you should start off with. When we're working with special education, we start with identifying the need, right? You want to identify your child's strengths, identify your child's weaknesses, right? The area of need, areas of concern. And in order to do that, there's many ways that we could do that, but the best way is to have your child evaluated. And that's usually a conversation that starts off, hopefully, it should start off with the child's pediatrician, right? They have you circle those little forms, bubbles, like when your child started walking, when your child started crawling, all that. to see if your child's meeting those developmental milestones, right? And then your child, hopefully your child gets referred to a specialist or neuropsychologist to get a neuropsych eval. And that can be done privately, right? That could be done to a hospital, like Children's Hospital, many of the hospitals in the state, or it could be done through a private organization. But if you don't have health insurance, right, or if you don't have good health insurance, you can also, as soon as your child turns 3, you can request that the school district do these evaluations. And you have that right to do that. And then the school district has to evaluate your child. And I mean, we can get into like the nitty gritty about the law, about how many days they have to do it. But, and that's something that I'm really happy to offer that information to anyone who's interested, and they can contact me. But really, it's important for families to know that there's timelines as to when the school has to evaluate the child. And my advice would be, once you get those evaluations, you want to pick through, you want to notice the strengths, right? Notice your child's strengths. Notice your child's weaknesses, because your child's strengths is what's going to help take care of the weaknesses, right? And you just want to make sure that you get all that information that you need, because that's going to kick off the special education process. And that's that's the very first step. That's the most important step, because once you know the areas of concern and your child's needs, then you know where to go. But if you don't mind, I'm going to just say real quick, because I wanted to say this at the beginning, but I want to, like, if I could yell off the rooftops right now, every child is different.
Yeah.
Every child is different. When we talk about the spectrum, like there are no 2 children on the same spot of the spectrum. It's just impossible. Every child has different strengths, different weaknesses. You can't compare your niece to your nephew and your child to your cousin. You just can't do it. And so that's the point of the evaluations, to see what it is that your child needs, and make sure that you make this all about your child, not about anyone else, but about your child. And the district should do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know that you talked about private versus, that could be covered with health insurance. And I know we can touch upon a little bit about that, because I know that for me, my understanding is that if you go to a private base organization or facility to do an evaluation for your child to see if your child has autism, ADHD, whatever the case may be, some private base individuals or agencies require for you to pay out of pocket, because it may not be covered through health insurance. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we get that question all the time, because one of the biggest things that we as an organization, we get a lot of messages from parents who may disagree with their school district, right? And, there's always that, the back and forth, and parents and schools, and, and oftentimes school districts say, well, why don't you get a private, evaluation and see what they say and see what they come up with. And then when parents are like, okay, good, I'm going to make some phone calls, and they realize, hey, you might have to come out of your pocket like $1,500. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, oh, where?
Right. Clenching your pearls, like, oh.
Exactly. You just like, it's happening. It's happening. Right. So talk to us a little bit about that, because those are like major barriers. And I think that, and also touch upon that some school districts make you do this, and sometimes they don't even take the evaluation that you did outside of the school, saying, well, we don't have to kind of own those, recommendations.
Right. Yeah, those are 2 big things, right? First being, if you don't agree with the school district's evaluation, right, you have the right to get a private evaluation, or what we call an independent evaluation. And if you are at the federal poverty guidelines or meet those guidelines, then the school district can pay for that. And that is a fun little fact for people to know. But what I like to do sometimes is, you can get the independent evaluation if you disagree with the school's evaluation, or you can have the school evaluate an area or do a specific test that they didn't do, right? So if they did not do, let's say, the WISC, right? The WISC is the test that looks at a child's IQ, right? I mean, every school does it, but let's just say they didn't, right? then you can ask that the school do that before you go get an independent evaluation. So technically, they would do the evaluation that they didn't do to begin with. But if you're not happy with the school's results, you can absolutely go get an independent evaluation at the district's expense. Second part, what happens when you come to the table and you're like, you put the evaluation on the table and you're like, here, the doctor said X, Y, and Z, right? And you have a list of recommendations. And technically, the district doesn't have to go by those recommendations. They don't have to adopt those recommendations, right? But this is where it's important for you to get an advocate, an attorney, if you need. And I mean, you can get creative. You can have something called an FBA, a functional behavioral assessment, where basically there's an observation, right? The school district will observe the student in school, and this will be based off real data that they see in the school, as opposed to, it being just something from a psychologist that saw the child for an hour or whatever. And I'll go into advocacy tips as well. I can do that as well. I was hoping to say.
I have a question with this FBA, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is for me and a personal question that I have, that I remember hearing about FBAs, never knew too much about them. I know that my son lost ABA services when he went into inclusion. Our school district here in Randolph said that he couldn't get ABA service in an inclusion setting, which was like all news to me. And I was hearing about the FBA, and one of our providers said that FBAs may not look good for children on their records, right? That it may bring some stigma to some of our babies navigating the system, that, something like that on their file may work against them more than helping them. Do you want to talk a little bit about those stigmas? Because I find that is that just a personal preference for some schools who, prejudge kids, right? Because, it happens. Or is it something that we should, as parents who have children that may have some unique behaviors that are necessarily not defiant behaviors, but that need some strategies to de-escalate our kids? Like, do you think that those assessments come with stigmas, and do they help or hurt our kids?
It's interesting because I haven't really heard about an FBA really causing a stigma. I know that the autism diagnosis in and of itself, and just having an IEP, has been said to be have some negative stigma on students. But an FBA is really just another evaluation. And the way that I look at it is that if you are, right, you're getting an evaluation, you're getting an observation, and the point of it is to gather some important data to help your child, then I would say go for it if that's what the parent wants. Today, this is perfect conversation. It's all on time. Today, I was at an IEP meeting. We were discussing the results of an FBA for a student on the spectrum, and we discussed different behaviors that the student was exhibiting, and the reason behind some of those behaviors, right? Whether he wanted to escape a specific task, or whether he wanted to, whether he was just looking for some attention, or whether he was upset that something was being taken away from him. But there were some really good recommendations at the end, because it was determined that 100% of his behavior was due to wanting to escape. And whether it's escape the task, not necessarily escape the room, but escape the task. And this is where they came up with some really good recommendations about, we hear about positive feedback all the time, and this is kind of like a cliche thing that you see on IEPs. But really, there were other good recommendations, like having him, they noticed that after 3 minutes, he gets a little irritable and he starts to lose focus, right? And so they decided that they would allow him 3 minutes to stay on task and give him a break for 2. 3 minutes to stay on task and give him a break for 2. And they have a little timer that they're going to use for him. I mean, this information wouldn't be helpful. Like, we wouldn't have this information if it wasn't for the FBA being done, right? So I guess it would be, I mean, it's a preference to every family. It's like, do you want to get this information, and do you want to work towards helping your child, or do you want to, or are you more worried about the school district having I guess a pre-existing opinion if the student moves to another school or another district? Technically, schools should not have pre-existing opinions, but I mean, we know how life is. There's some good apples, there's some bad ones. But I think the data, right? Danielle says, right, the data, right? The data. That's what we need, is the data. I think that's really most important. Oh, and then Kathleen says the FBA leads to a behavior plan. So that's what we talked about. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. If it is necessary, and this may even include safety plans for kids who have trouble with staying in the classroom, and kids who are bolting, right? Kids who want to leave the school. So it's really important, I guess, to at least have that data if you feel that it's necessary. But it's not always necessary for students, right? There's some students who show no kind of like negative behaviors when it comes to, and I say negative because that's, I guess, the term to use, but really that don't show any difficult behavior, I guess, when it comes to, learning and engaging in the classroom. And
so, I mean, go ahead, because I know you was about to say something. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I interrupted you.
No, so I mean, I don't know. So I have so many questions, right? And I know that special education itself needs a lot of reform, and I kind of dislike using that term, right? Because it just feels like prison, prison type talk, like criminal justice type talk. But as someone who's working in the Children Law Center, what are your biggest, what are the biggest cases that you deal with in terms of services, and how do they differentiate from district to district?
I do see, well, one of the biggest issues that I see sometimes in school districts, I'll say, is copy pasted IEPs. Ooh, that makes me so mad. Because like I said in the beginning, and I'm probably gonna say like 4 or 5 times during our discussion, but every child is different, right? So copy pasted reinforcements or accommodations in the IEP really bug me, especially when the accommodations are things that should be offered to every student, special education or not. Positive reinforcement. Okay, great. So does that mean that we're giving the atypical kids negative reinforcement? Like, I don't understand that, right? Or, repeat instructions that the child needs. So are we not repeating instructions with other kids? You know what I mean? Like, that's one thing that really bugs me. But services do differ from district to district, right? Without getting too specific on the districts, because I'm feeling nice today, so I'm not calling any districts out. But there's some districts that have a lot of classrooms, right? Different types of teachers, different supports, inclusion classrooms. Some have separate classrooms, substantially separate classrooms, which are self-contained classrooms. Some districts have a bunch of paraprofessionals to give one-to-one support. Others have breakout rooms, and when I know breakout rooms right now is, getting pulled out of the Zoom class, but some have like these really quiet spaces or these sensory spaces, right? Sensory sensitive spaces where kids can go to. It just all depends on the district. And of course, I mean, if we're gonna keep it real, right? There are some districts that have more than others, and it's usually districts that the districts that offer less usually are the districts with lower income families. And it could be due to, lack of resources. And of course, the affluent districts offer more. I looked at an IEP from Linfield the other day that was amazing. I mean, I was like, ooh, I love this IEP. And then the child switched districts, and that new district created a new IEP, and it was not amazing. So, I mean, there's definitely differences in districts, and that's unfortunate, right? Because there shouldn't be these equity issues, but I mean, there are, you know.
And that's a lot because I found that too. You know, let's say when I was living in Boston and I moved here to Randolph, you know, my son was in a full day preschool program before we moved here. And then when I got here, you know, not doing no research, I just wanted to get out the city because I was living in, you know, off a top lift and, you know, very high crime ridden area. And I'm like, you know, I'm tired of my car getting broken into. I'm
Yeah.
tired of shooting them up, bang, bang, right? And I was like, you know, I got to get the kids out of the city and, you know, go somewhere, you know, that's still close to the city, has the same diversity, you know, population. And then, but when I switched districts, again, you know, he was in a full day preschool program in Boston. And then when we got here, I didn't realize that Randolph Public Schools did not offer a full day preschool program for students unless they were in a self-contained, sub-separate setting. And I'm like, okay, well, in the school that he was at before, they were kind of already moving towards integration and all that stuff. So like I had to, you know, fight that little battle to keep him in his, you know, in a full day in the full day program because his IEP from Boston Public Schools specifically stated that. So they had to honor what was on his IEP. And in addition to that, we lost so many services compared to when we were in Boston compared to here. You know, and Boston was a little bit more advanced in services than Randolph. And it was a complete nightmare. And you know, the communication was poor. It seemed like there was already some hostility, and I'm like, what is the problem? But you know, like you said, it differs from district to district. Some districts invest more, you know, and can you talk a little bit about how special education is funded? Because I think that this is something that we have to always bring up when we're having the conversation of special education, because special education is funded by our tax dollars, right? So can you touch a little bit upon you know, about that? Because I think that there is a, you know, that's a good conversation to have because if you're in a lower income community, there's already a financial deficit in those communities. And so there's lack of investment and, you know, talk to us about that.
Sure. So first, I want to say that I'm sorry that you had to go through that, going through such a change between districts and getting different services. When you do change districts, they're supposed to offer, the new district is supposed to offer basically comparable services. And if they can't, let's say your child needs a certain setting and the school district can't offer that, then they can contract with another district to offer those services. And I want to just say briefly, we took the Children's Law Center along with CLE, the Center of Law and Education. We took a case to the Bureau of Special Education's Appeals, so the BSEA, and basically our argument is that your child doesn't need to have an out-of-district placement, like a public day school or a private day school or even a residential program to have and to get an education outside of the child's district, right? So let's just say, for example, if let's say you wanted a self-contained class, right? But your district didn't offer it, well, then you can go to the next town over to get that. And the school district should be able to contract with that town to do that. So I just want
to fall under school choice.
No, that's not school choice. That's called FAPE. It's a free and appropriate public education, right? And there's this thing called a least restrictive environment. So what you do is you see what the students' needs are, number one, right? And you see the services and accommodations that student needs, and then you determine, okay, what would be the appropriate placement for that child based on the services that they need. Where can these services and these accommodations, where can that be implemented? And if that is in a placement, right, that your school district doesn't have, then they can get that at another school district. So a public day school, for example, right, or a private day school is a special ed school, period. There's just all special ed students in the school. So your child will not really have an opportunity to interact with non-disabled peers, right? That's more restrictive than a school that's a regular general ed school, but that has special ed programs, right? Because in that school, your child can interact with non-disabled students and, of course, still get the supports that he or she needs. And so theoretically, it would be better for that student or your child to receive those services in a typical school than to go to a special ed school. And if that typical school just so happens to be out of the district, then it is what it is. It's out of the district. And that's a hot topic, actually. That's something that
you're making it sound so good, and I'm sitting here like,
it's a hot topic.
I hear so many parents that it doesn't even sound like that. It sounds like the minute that a parent says anything about FAPE, IDEA, IDEA, it turns into, the school district pull up to a meeting. They got an attorney. You're like, well, I don't have an attorney. Where's my attorney?
Right.
And it turns into this big old shebang. And it's true. And parents have to literally, especially like a parent like myself, I do not have the financial means to pay an advocate $100 an hour to represent me at an IEP meeting. I don't have $100 an hour for them to review my child's IEP and assessments. I just don't have that type of money. And then in addition to that, when I know that I'm like, hey, so you don't have this program here, but it looks like Braintree, that's right, the town next to mine, has that program. How can I get my child there? Then there's a stipulation where Braintree Public Schools, let's say, for example, that says you have to have a residency requirement and all the stipulations. And then they don't explain it to me like you would explain it to me, is that we're local agencies, we're a partnership, and we should be able to make these magic happen without so many like legality issues. It's not how they present it,
right? And you know what, they're not going to. And it's a contractual thing. It's a contractual thing, let's say, between Braintree and Randolph, right? It's not about your child is being placed in a special education program based on his needs. It's not he's going to the school and accessing the curriculum because it's a school choice situation. Which brings me to answering your question about finances, right? Like, how is this funded? So special education is federally funded, right? And it's also funded. So the federal government hands over a certain amount of money to the states, and then the states fund the districts, right? So let's say, for example, you have a atypical child or a child that's not disabled, right? That child will be worth, let's say, $5. I'm using like very basic numbers, but let's say that child is worth $5, right? So whatever school that child goes to, that $5 follows the kid, right? So if the kid's in Boston, $5 is going to Boston Public Schools. If the kid goes to a charter school, $5 go to the charter school, right? And so if that kid is in special education, now that kid gets $10. So it's $10 that's following that kid, right? So the reason for this is so that school, the district can have the means in order to support students in special education. But this is where it gets tricky, right? So let's say I have a child who's worth $10 because he has a disability, and you have a child who's worth $10 because he has a disability, but my child just needs counseling. That's it, just one time a week. And your child needs counseling. Your child needs to be in a self-contained classroom. Your child needs to have a BCBA. Your child needs a paraprofessional. Your child needs occupational therapy, physical therapy. And so therefore your child has exhausted his $10. And he's like, I would say, borrowing from my child, right? And so you have a situation now where as you go into districts, the more students in special education, the tighter the pockets get, right? Because the more resources the district has to spend. So one would argue that perhaps it may be in a district's best interest not to identify that child, or to identify that child as having a disability, but not to give certain services because there's a tight, they're tight on money. And so, I mean, this is something that's important for people to think about, because when you go to those IEP meetings and you notice, okay, they're okay with giving my child speech therapy, but why do they not want to give my child a paraprofessional or a one-to-one aid? What's the problem with putting my child in this inclusion class? I think he would do great in the inclusion class. Well, that inclusion class is full. And they've received one resume for that open position. And that one person is not even a great candidate. So, I mean, these are things to think about when you go into IEP meetings, is to think, well, what is the position on the other side? And I don't want to say this is all districts, because I don't want to bash all districts, and I don't mean to bring this pessimistic view, but I'm keeping it real, right? It is what it is. This is what we see in a lot of districts. This is what we see in a lot of schools, And it's important as parents, when we sit down at that table, we know this. We're equipped with knowledge. We know what's up. We know what's happening. So that you can't tell me, oh, my child doesn't need a one-to-one aid, when my child can't even stay in the seat for 2 seconds because he's already running out the door.
Well,
Guess what? If something happens to my child, that's going to cost the district a little bit extra more.
yeah, because my son runs out the route, and that happened to me. So,
wow.
Fun fact, right? Not fun fact, because I almost lost it. So when my son started Boston Public Schools, he was in a self-contained, sub-separate classroom, and in a Boston Public Schools that I'll remain nameless. And the teacher, first of all, was amazing. And I think I tell the story all the time. Her child had a disability, and so she was kind of out more than she was in the classroom. And every time I would go pick up my son, literally a different substitute, literally all the time. I would pick up my son. He would have clothes that didn't even belong to him, that didn't even fit him. You just can tell it was just too much. He wasn't making any progress. He was happy, though. You can tell he was happy when his teacher was there. And when she was there, you can just tell the difference of his energy when I would go pick him up from school. But I went through that, and it was horrifying, because the first thing that I said in my head, I'm like, if something would have happened to my son, we would have had a really big problem, like a very, very big problem. And it happens. And at this time, I'm working for the school district. So I feel like I have like a bit of a muzzle, right? Because I'm working for the same school district my child is in. So I'm like, if I start barking, am I going to lose my job? You know what I mean? Like, it was so many things, which is how I ended up moving from Boston out here, whatever the case may be. But, I didn't know anything about the one-to-one. So I started learning all of these things as my journey as an autism mom, as a special education mom. You talk to other parents, which other parents are super instrumental. And I find more parents to be more of experts than people that are in this field, who, you could sit at these IEP meetings. And I always keep it real. I feel like IEP meetings are like mob sit downs. It's like parents always hear about themselves, either with their significant other, their, whatever the advocate. And then all the people with all the fancy acronyms behind their last names are sitting on the opposite side. There's already that division between us, right? It already feels like they got their guard up. I got my guard up. And oftentimes, a lot of them don't even know the resources in the community to share to you. You know what I mean? Like, I've always found myself like, I mean, for some people, they see it complaining. To me, I sense more parents who are venting. And then if people really pay attention and they listen to parents are literally asking you for help. It just doesn't sound that way. And if you are unable to connect a family to a local resource in their community, or someone that offers a service of in-home therapy, we have the CBHI services. If you have a school district and a special education team that can't even tell you that, that's problematic, right? And I see this all the time. And again, but like you said, different school districts,
Right.
right? That, have a little bit more money and have literally a guidance counselor for every school, every grade level, have, their staff members who can tell you, those wraparound services, right? But here in the hood, they're not telling you that.
And even more importantly, the people who are in charge for giving you this information don't look like us. That's another thing. It's like someone who grew up in Boston, right? So I'm sure even some of the people watching this right now know me, right? Like I grew up, I'm Boston all the way, Boston public schools all the way, grew up in Boston, right? And I can identify some of the areas, right? Some resources, some supports for kids across the board. I mean, do you need a therapist? I can connect you with a therapist. Do you need an evaluation? I can connect you with an evaluator, right? Do you need some support, some shelter support, some clothing support, some, do you have some kind of food insecurities? All of that I can help with, right? Because I'm from here, right? I know what I've been through it. I've been in the situation, and unfortunately, a lot of people are not from the area where they teach. They don't look like us. They haven't encountered the things that we've encountered, and they just can't relate, right? But that's not an excuse, because if they can't relate, they should learn, right? They should learn about our culture, all of our cultures. They should learn about the resources in the area. They should provide this information. It's not fair that it's only provided by some people, and some people and others just don't have that information. And I think that a lot of that is a top-down approach too. There should be at least a spreadsheet with this information at every school, right? It is really unfortunate. And that's why it's important when you go to these IEP meetings that you come with your crew, right?
Oh.
Come with your crew. I've been at IEP meetings. This is before the pandemic. I've been at IEP meetings where they had to roll in chairs from other classrooms because parents brought their parents. They brought their sisters. They brought their cousins. They brought the in-home therapist. They brought their private psychologist. They brought the BCBA. We filling up rooms, and now who's on the other side of the table, right?
And they feel intimidated because now they know that there's a parent who comes with wraparound services.
Exactly.
Who can tell them, listen, well, these are the things that we're seeing at home. What are you guys seeing here? And then therefore they actually have to work on a collective plan, not a one-sided plan.
Right. And I want to take the time at least for a moment to say that, this is not all across the board, right? I've been at IEP meetings where, it's been amazing. The people, the teachers are so invested. The ETFs or the team chairs are so invested. I've had that happen. But sometimes it doesn't. We talk about a quick little funny story. Listen to this. I went to an IEP meeting for my own child. And I sat down and listened to a particular person tell me about the law. And it was completely inaccurate.
Yeah, I've been there.
You didn't know I was an education attorney.
Yeah, I go up and you're like, what you talking about, Willis? Because that don't even sound right.
Right. I'm just sitting here like, yes, that's intriguing. But in reality, it wasn't true. It wasn't the law. And of course, when I, let them know, what I do for a living, obviously the whole tone changed. But I'm just saying, can you imagine, parents who don't have this knowledge? I didn't have this. I didn't even know special education was an area of law when I first became a parent. I didn't know that, but other people do, and other people know the law, and your in-home therapist knows the law, and your care coordinator knows the law. And so does the speech therapist. And and if you come in with them, they can definitely help you. And if they can't come because their schedule is tight, have them write letters. I've seen Joe do X, Y, and Z. He needs help with this, that, and the third. And these are the recommendations, and you come in.
Girls, we see them on the email. So any email threads, because I learned this the hard way. CC everybody and their mother in that email, including from the superintendent, whether she reads it or not, all the way down to shoot. Listen, if I have to add the maintenance people, the custodial, I'm gonna add them to the email because they see my kids too.
Right.
And they're building relationships with my kids.
That's what I was gonna say. It's important to put everything in writing, like everything in writing. You just had a conversation and they said, "Hey, your child is doing amazing. I mean, he had a little hiccup today, but he was able to get himself together when we pulled him aside to talk to him, and he was able to regroup." Dear Miss So and So, thank you so much for the discussion that we had today over the phone, where you had stated X, Y, and Z. I mean, if you need to put everything in writing because you're worried that you're not going to get a certain service, or you're experiencing like a roadblock with the school, right? That's important. Rachel, call me.
Email her. Email's right there, hon. Email her.
Yeah, she has my number. So yeah, I do think that getting everything documented is really important. And even try to have things, after the IEP meeting, take good notes. Oh my God, you should see my notes. Like I have, little yellow pads, and I fill them up front to back. Sometimes I have 6-7 pages at the end of an IEP meeting. People think I'm crazy because I'm over here scribbling, because I'm old school. I'm not typing it, I'm scribbling it, right? And then I go back and I'll look at an IEP and I just like compare and contrast, like, we didn't agree to that. Or, that's not what we said. Or, whoa, they completely forgot to put this in the additional information part of the IEP, So it's important, document everything. Make sure that you write down your communications. Even if you don't feel comfortable sending an email saying, oh, we spoke about this, you write it down in your own, for your own records, like on this date at this time, so and so called me and said X, Y, and Z. Because if they don't want to believe that you said that, then that you had that conversation, they're essentially calling you a liar. And I don't think that they want to go that route.
That's how relationships go to the left.
Yeah. Yeah, and you want to try to keep it cordial too. Yeah. But sometimes, these are IEPs, special education, are babies. It's an emotional thing. Crying is normal at IEP meetings. It's emotional, and sometimes a particular person may not feel those emotions anymore when it's their third IEP meeting of the day, and you're the third person to cry. And so, you know your baby best, what's necessary, and turn those tears into action, and do what you got to do to advocate for your child. And I'm here. I know you mentioned about advocates, $100 an hour. There are many, there are resources out there. There's the Children's Law Center in Essex County. There's GBLS in Boston. I know a lot of people are familiar with GBLS. There's South Coast.
Tell us the full name of it, because some people may not know the acronyms.
I'm sorry, Greater Boston Legal Services in Boston. They have education attorneys there. They're amazing. And then there's South Coastal, which like the Justice Center does. They're based out of Brockton. And then there's I forgot what county, Bristol County. So they attend IEP meetings there. There's Center for Law and Education may be able to help in Boston, CLE. There's different organizations. There's EdLaw in Boston. There's Mass Advocates for Children. You can call any of these organizations, even if you want to just vent. Worcester is, oh my God, Nikki's gonna kill me. So we have Nikki Cardamone in Worcester. I forgot the name of the organization, but I'll let you know, Rachel. And there's usually an organization for every county. And so it's important, to reach out to these legal aid organizations, because even if they don't have the capacity to represent you, at the very least, they can provide technical assistance. They can provide advice. I provide advice whether or not you're in Essex County. I help my friends. I help my family. I help people who message me through Facebook, people who call the Children's Law Center. You don't have to be in Essex County for me to offer some advice, But we also have on our website, on the Children's Law Center, we have these they're like flyers or these one pagers that have a lot of information about the laws. It's like quick reference guides, what we call them. And you can look at those and just have like little, little bits of knowledge when you go into these IEP meetings. Because it's important, I mean, to be equipped with knowledge. And like you said, Jahida, when you start going in there saying words like FAPE and least restrictive environment and IDEA, people start acting funny, right? They're like, what does she know? So be prepared for that too,
And then I know that you talked about there's like 7 areas to consider, when we're talking about special education, especially specifically tailored to autism. And this might also work for non-autistic children. Can you touch upon those 7 areas to consider?
Yes. Thank you. So there is actually, there's a law, right? It's Chapter 71B, Section 3, which outlines exactly right. I'm such a lawyer. I'm over here quoting the law.
Yeah.
It outlines all of the considerations that an IEP team needs to consider when they are discussing a child with a diagnosis of autism. Mm-hmm. So those 7 areas. First of all, they need to discuss the needs of the child, the communication needs, right? So what are the child's nonverbal and verbal communication needs? We already know with our babies with autism, that tends to be a big area where they struggle. The social needs, right? How does that child interact with other students? What does that child need in order to engage in play, right? Engage in conversation with other students. The sensory needs, right? My son doesn't like tags. He takes his socks and shoes off everywhere. And he rolls
the stripper. My son used to take off his clothes at the park, and I knew when it was time to go when I seen that sock go up in the air, and I'm like, oh, time for us to go because he's on overload. So
yes, what is that? Like
he's gonna be running around naked in the park.
I cannot tell you how many socks I have in my mom van. Let me tell you, they're just in the crevice. It's just so but that's a sensory thing, right? So what kind of support are they going to offer? And then also like food aversion. Which is something that's kind of typical for some of our babies. And then there's the needs resulting from change in daily schedules, right? Because our kids need to have like set schedule. Most of our kids, again, putting it out there, every child is different, but some kids need to have a very set schedule. And what happens when that schedule changes, right? Because our kids are not going to be in, let's say first grade forever with Mrs. Smith, right? There's going to be transitioning at some point. They need to discuss the needs resulting from engaging in repetitive activities or stereotype movements. For example, some kids have like involuntary twitches, or some kids hit, there's stimming. Some kids do, stim. There's different, and then how does that affect the student physically, right? Is there a safety concern? But also bullying concern, right? How is that going to affect the way that child interacts with other kids? That's something that the team needs to consider. Number 6, so I know I didn't number them all, but number 6 is the need for positive behavioral interventions, which what we talked about earlier, an FBA. You don't have to do a functional behavioral assessment, but there needs to be, positive behavioral interventions, strategies, and supports for every, I think every student, but specifically something to look at for students on the spectrum. And then lastly, it's like the catch-all, like any other needs, emotional needs that some students need. So, these are areas that is very specific to students on the spectrum, and districts should be talking about this. How many districts say, does your child have sensory needs when you have a child with autism at an IEP meeting? Well, guess what? They're supposed to. Chapter 71B, Section 3. And so this is good information for you to know so that you can talk to the district about how they're going to accommodate your child with these things, these specific needs.
So I know that there was a question, and I think that we kind of touched upon it. I'm not sure. We kind of touched a little bit upon it earlier, but I'm not really sure we went into in depth. I know that many parents, like myself, have declined to sign an IEP because sometimes, and this happens, that sometimes a conversation that we had at the IEP meeting, and then when I get my IEP, I'm like, I don't remember this being a topic of conversation. Not sure why this is. So I've declined an IEP. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know that there's a lot of parents that don't sign these IEPs, and they kind of need to know about the state put law and what happens, because there is that thing that if you don't sign that IEP, your child might not be getting them services. And guess what? They might not even tell you it either. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first of all, community legal aid, Worcester County. Community legal aid is in Worcester County. Now I remember the name of the organization. I'm sorry. Yeah, there's 3 options. I tag on a 4th option, but this is just a personal preference. But there are 3 options when you get an IEP, and there's something on it that you can either accept the IEP in full, which is great. I love it. Send it back, and it's accepted, right? And services start immediately. Or you can reject the IEP in full. And if you reject the IEP in full, you're saying, I don't like anything on here. And then the IEP, the last signed IEP, is what we call stay put. It's the active IEP, the one that determines what services that child is going to get in the interim while you meet, while you discuss, the rejected IEP, right? And then there's you can partially reject an IEP. And so you can, for example, I do this all the time. I partially reject them all the time. For example, I might say, you know what? I don't like this goal, right? I like the service that's attached to the goal, right? This kid has a severe communication issue, right? He struggles with communicating. He has nonverbal communication difficulties, functional communication difficulties, all of that. And yes, he needs speech therapy 3 times a week for 30 minutes. I'm not rejecting the services. Let's give him the speech therapy 3 times a week for 30 minutes. But what I'm rejecting is the goal. This needs to be revamped. It needs to be tailored to my child. It needs to say what the benchmarks are for my child. By, let's say, by the end of the IEP period, student will acknowledge or follow 1-step directions, right? And then another thing I want to add about that is the whole IEP shouldn't just say what your child's going to do. It should say what the school is going to do, right? So,
say that again, because I couldn't hear you. Say that again.
The school should acknowledge what they're going to do, not what your child is going to do, right? So, so it should say on the goal, with adult supervision, given 2 or 3 prompts, your child will do X, Y, and Z, or follow 1-step directions, because it's not just your child is going to do this, your child is going to do that, right? Anyway, you can reject some of it, accept some of it, and you can be very specific. You can also reject stuff that's not in there, right? Reject the fact that it's not in there. I do that too. I accept everything in the IEP, but I'm rejecting the fact that you didn't put this little bit of information in. I wanted you to put lunch bunch and additional information. You didn't do that. So I'm rejecting that, right?
And a good part of rejecting too is I tell this to parents all the time. Make sure, especially when you have children that are maybe 2nd grade and below, that a lot of parents want the back and forth communication, especially for parents who have children in the self-contained classrooms that require a little bit more intense support. You can reject it because they did not stipulate that you guys have a communication notebook that you and the teacher communicate through a notebook that, every day you open it up and it states, X, Y, and Z didn't use the bathroom today, or some form of communication. You can also document that, because I know that at one point in time I asked for some level of like progress reporting, whether it was those smiley face that said, you know, today we had a good day, today we had a bad day, or a quick little, you know, note from the teacher that tells me, you know, he didn't eat today. I had those things. So those are really
Right.
good data keeping skills, you
Yeah.
know, documentation things that kind of build certain, you know, things. So you can add that and reject your IEP if it doesn't stipulate that.
Right. And that's exactly true. And I'm not even going to get into the grid, the service delivery grid, because that's a whole nother conversation. But you could even have that put into the IEP as an actual service in grid A. You can say, and this happened actually, we had this done today, just today, that the school will contact the parent one time a week for 15 minutes to discuss the student's progress. That's it. And then, like you said, you can add all of those little details in the additional information section of the IEP. These things can be put in because technically an IEP is a legal contract, right? It's a binding contract between the district and the parent. And I wanted to mention too, I don't think I mentioned this, is just be careful when you do reject, and I think you mentioned this or you were alluding to this, is that when you do reject an IEP, be careful about stay put, because if it's the first IEP, meaning there was no IEP before this, and it's the very first IEP, whatever you reject, it doesn't start. So if you're rejecting the entire IEP because you're mad about one little section, I don't mean to say you're mad about, you're not happy with one little section, don't completely reject it. Just reject that one section, because then the occupational therapy services can start, or the kid can start in the inclusion classroom that you guys agreed to. So you can just reject that portion. And then there's the fourth option that I say, that I don't think I've heard anyone else say this, but I do this all the time, and I find that it works really well. You don't have to do any of that. Sometimes you just got to send an email or make a call. Hey, look, you know what? Because remember, this is a draft. They're proposing this. This isn't the end all be all.
Yep.
This is not the end all be all. Parents, folks, family, friends. When you get an IEP, you're not bound by that, right? You can talk to the school. Hey, I really wasn't happy about this terminology. I really think that you should have added this. Is it possible you can add that? I had that my son can listen to have his headphones on during quiet time in the classroom. I had that added to the IEP. I didn't reject the IEP. I didn't partially reject it. I just called up the person and I was like, hey, look, can you add this? And she was like, yeah, sure. And then she added it and sent me a new one. And it just went way smoother than going through that whole process. So, you know, communication is key. There's always that option, you know. Those are the options when you receive an IEP. But like I said, document, like you said, if you want to CC the superintendent, that's fine. I don't typically do that.
I'm petty. I'm very petty, y'all. No, so I do it sometimes, not all the time, depending on the situation, you know.
Yeah, it's a relationship.
Yeah, sometimes I am very purposeful when it comes to certain things, especially when you live in small districts like Randolph, right? Because we only have four elementaries, one middle, one high school, and we have under 3,000 students, right? And I typically tend to include certain people in emails because I'm like, hey, this might be a little kinky. I need to work out. You don't want it to turn into something, right? And I've developed those relationships with some people. I know that sometimes they're like, oh, here comes Ms. Lopez, and I'm like, hi, how are you? How are we doing? And I'm like, can we have a conversation? But you're right. It doesn't always have to be. It doesn't always have to go up those chain of commands. It really does. And
but if it needs to, it needs to. Again, I've done that. I have some really good relationships with some superintendents. One who I meet with once a month. And he's really committed to hearing out some of my concerns and the concerns of the parents in the district. So I mean, it definitely does. It does depend. Yeah, definitely.
And it's also, I think that regardless of the fact, right? Because some relationships are healthy, some are not. But I also think that it's just as parents, regardless of, the level of frustration that we may have, I may joke around and I may say a lot of things, but I do feel like there sometimes should be a healthy, diplomatic type of conversation and relationship, even though there's been times that I've had to kind of say, hey, listen, we're not doing this today. I am not the one. So either we can have a really good conversation, or, I might, come out of character. But and it's fine, because once you build those relationships, they're gonna know, and they'll pick up on that energy fast, or they'll, try to rectify it, or whatever the case may be. But it does take it's a two-way street. It's absolutely
two-way street. And actually, I encourage families sometimes, if you have family members or friends or people that through Facebook who are teachers, have conversations with them. If you have a special ed teacher that's on your timeline, and you never really talk to them, ask them for a call and just get their perspective, because we're all human, right? And there may be things that teachers are going through that we don't know about, right? Or they may be having a day, or or they may be not getting the resources that they want and deserve from a higher level. And so, I mean, although that's not an excuse to to not provide a service for a child, it's good information. It's good to know it. And the last thing you want to do is have a difficult relationship with the person who's with your child. What is it, 6 hours a day? So, I mean, you don't necessarily want that. I mean, if you have to, you have to. But I mean, it is good to have those good relationships, and for them to see both sides, not just like the angry side, but like the cool side, the one that might slip somebody like a quick little, card or something like that, during the holidays, like, oh yeah, I know I've been a little, rough around the edges this year, but here's a card.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here's some donuts. Here's a Dunkin' Donuts Starbucks card. Thank you.
Right. I think they can accept get like $25. So it's important to have that relationship, because really what you're doing is you're just helping your child.
Yeah.
Really all for your child. And as parents, in the end of the day, everything we do is for our children. Every single thing. And when we're angry and we're emotional, it's because we care.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes, to be clear, the enemy is sometimes not even your teachers, right? The enemy is the system, the design of the system. The system's old, it's dated, it needs to be revamped. It needs to come to the 21st century, right? And we've seen it during this global pandemic, that all the ugly truths you can't avoid them. We know that a lot of our children's schools are poorly ventilated. We know this. So it's not just your children that are inhaling, toxic, air. Teachers are too. Administrators are too, right? And so these things are a systems issue. And oftentimes, you have teachers too who have family members and have children to feed, household, a house to pay, rent to pay, insurance and all those other things. So they have kind of the same burdens that many, societal burdens that many of us we have as parents. So it's
yeah, we saw that.
It has to come with a healthy boundary. And it's honestly, as much as I joke, guys, I honestly really do have very more open and close relationships with my children's teachers than not. I would say at the beginning, it wasn't like that. Because I did not, I was mama bear. I was like, y'all ain't gonna be playing with my baby. And then I also worked for a school district, and I seen a lot of the in-house foolishness and a lot of the politics that happened behind the scenes. And I already kind of had that guard up, and I had to learn to come to the table with offering more solutions and understanding the resources and understanding the laws, and holding people to task in a way that I don't necessarily have to tell them to go kick rocks, right? So, it has to be, because you'll be unhappy, your child is going to be unhappy, and you're going to get more calls. And the whole switching of schools and that whole process, kind of like what Stephanie was trying to say, is not as easy as some may make it seem to be, it's a process. And that process could be long and excruciating and stressful.
Right. Right. We're here for you. Jahida is here for you. I'm here for you. We're just, I mean, this is what we're here to offer support. One thing Jahida had mentioned to me earlier, Jahida, you said was, you know, sometimes families are just tired of this. They're just tired of being spoken to. Oh, here's the law. Here's how to advocate. Here's the law. Here's how to advocate. And people are just so tired sometimes of hearing that, because in the end of the day, they need action, right? They need someone to support. They need someone at that table with them. And that's what we, you know, us legal aid folks do. And, you know, I have to say, you know, being a part of, you know, the education advocacy world, I guess, right now, I do talk to a lot of private attorneys too, who are willing to represent you pro bono, free of charge, that are willing to represent your children for very small fees or sliding scale fees as well. So, I mean, don't feel, you know, if we have long lists or, you know, you can't access a legal aid professional right away, don't feel defeated, because there are so many people able to help and that want to help, because, I mean, our children are our future. It's cliche, but it's true, right? Because that's who we're handing, you know, this world off to, is our children, and we need to prepare them. They need to be prepared, disability or not. I mean, thankfully, we're, you know, turning a corner where we're in an era where we're starting to, you know, really understand mental health. We're understanding disabilities more. We're not where we need to be, probably not even close. But I mean, at least we got people talking now. And we're here for you. If, you know, if you have questions, we're always here for you. My email is down at the bottom. Don't feel alone. Don't feel alone. Yeah, because you're not alone. You're not, you know.
And guys, there's tons of parent-led Facebook groups. You know, there a lot of nonprofits nowadays have their Facebook groups for their participants, their clients. You know, Autism Sprinter has a Facebook group. So if you want to join our Facebook group, please join it. It, you know, it's a lot of parent to parent conversations. And, you know, you know, it's cliche, but I feel like parents are experts. The difference between other people and us is that, you know, some people have to go to school to get those fancy acronyms. You know, once we birth those children, we are the doctor, we are the nurse, we are the occupational therapist, we are the physical therapist, we are, you know, the behavior therapist. We're all of those people without the financial compensation in the degrees, you know, and sometimes our expertise can really drive these IEP meetings to be crafted the way that it's truly tailored to the needs of our children. So,
and I always say, that leads me to the point of, you know, the smell test, right? If you go into an IEP meeting and something don't smell right, it don't sound right, it's not right. If they're telling you your child is reading an entire book and your child can barely even sound out the letter A or C at home, call that out. Wait a minute. I'm not doing that at home. I don't see that at home. Can you please explain to me how that's happening? What are you doing? How is that? You know, how are you working with him? When do you see that? What time of the day do you see that? How do you know? You know, like, really ask those questions, because and this is something that I told my sister, and I'm sorry, she might get upset with me for saying that, but you know, when they say you know, always question when they say these great things. Your child is doing amazing. This is amazing. That is amazing. They're doing great. We're here and there. If it don't feel right and don't sound right because you're not seeing that at home, call that out, because although it's a good feeling to hear about how great your child is doing, remember what we talked about earlier. Like, think about, okay, why would they be saying this? What benefit is it to them to not provide these services to my child?
All right, guys. So we've been at this for already like an hour and a half. So Stephanie, close us out. Tell us where people can find you. I know that there's a big thing that you've worked on. That thank you for including us. So talk to us a little bit about that and close us out.
All right. So What Jahida's talking about is what I know a lot of people probably know about right now is the Boston Public School exams debacle that's going on right now with the new admissions process. I guess to quickly sum it up, we're just trying to support Boston Public School in their new admissions plan or their temporary admission plan to help brown and black students, low socioeconomic students from low socioeconomic homes, and just all students just have an access to the exam schools. And we did a brief on that, the Children's Law Center, the MLRI, which is Mass Law Reform Institute, and Latino Justice, and Jahida's organization, Autism Sprinter, signed on. Many other organizations signed on. Thank you so much for that. At the Children's Law Center, we do all kinds of work. We do direct representation. We get involved in systemic work. We're involved in holding schools accountable with their disciplinary measures for schools, especially disproportionately implemented disciplinary measures. And we're just here for you. You can get at me on the email below, s.rodriguez-ruiz@clcm.org. You can follow me on Facebook. I'm not going to guarantee the most politically correct Facebook page. I don't pretend.
At your own will, because I say the same thing. I'm like, guys, listen, when you add me, just so you know, I kind of speak my mind. I know that I'm a founder, so please don't put me in that box. I'm still a human being first,
I'm a human being. You're not going to get the the little, politically correct lawyer from me. Sometimes I say some things. Sometimes I find things funny that other people might not find funny. It's okay. This is we all who we are, right? We accept each other as we are. So you can follow me on Facebook and go on to the children's website, so the Children's Law Center website, and also like the Children's Law Center Facebook page. And then, of course, once you get on there, you have our contact information, our phone numbers, everything, our hotline. We're here for you.
All right, guys. So thank you, Steph. We about to close out. So guys, again, thank you. This live is always going to remain on our Facebook. So for those that are first time viewers, please go into our video section. Throughout this pandemic, we've had series after series. We have tons of freebies that include occupational therapy tools, ABA tools, buy an ABA provider. We have, we have a little bit of everything. We've even had another amazing special education workshop with Christina Laster of the National Parents Union. She was also very phenomenal. And we have tons of free gems in this space. So please check out the videos, rewatch. You can also find us on YouTube. The video is going to be uploaded to YouTube this evening. And so again, these are free 99, y'all. Free 99. Y'all don't have to pay for these, because most times a lot of these workshops, they do, and I know, Stephanie, some people charge fees for these. And a lot of the work that we do in Autism Sprinter is to making sure that our communities that are underrepresented, have access to free tools to better support their families. So with that being said, guys, good night. Thank you for coming. Steph, I'm going to hit you up. And thank you so much for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. You're amazing.
And I appreciate and I love to see autism moms, changing the narrative, because oftentimes a lot of people think that autism moms stay at home, we collect Social Security, we don't do nothing. And that's not necessarily the case. We got a lot of parents out here that get up and go to work, and they're advocating in their own communities. So, I appreciate you. I appreciate
you.
All right, guys. Good night.
Autism Sprinter. Think equity. Yeah. It's time to give the power back to the people. We're fighting to make our beliefs equal. Look at the failed policies and how they treat you. We got strength, yeah, we're far from feeble. This is for anyone with autism or a disability. Time to unite, show 'em how strong our will can be. Move readily, we're promoting equity. A non-profit platform, that's the recipe. Now throw your hands up, we finally got a winner. Think equity with autism sprinter. Now throw your hands up, we finally got a winner. Think equity with autism sprinter. It's time to make a change. It's time to stand up for what we believe in. Equality and equity across the board. No matter your race, nation, or creed, disability, or your needs. Yes, it gotta be equal. It gotta be right.